What makes Everest so instructive isn't the extremity of the environment, it's how familiar the decision dynamics are. Because if you strip away the altitude, you're left with something many of us recognize: pressure, commitment, incomplete information, and decisions that have to be made without guarantees on what happens next. You're listening to The Uncertainty Edge, the show about the art and science of moving forward when the path isn't clear. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan. Each episode, I sit down with leaders, advisors, and thinkers to explore how they navigate uncertainty, make better decisions, and stay focused in a world that rarely cooperates. Together, we'll look for the clarity hidden inside uncertainty. Welcome back to the podcast. If you've been listening for a while, you'll notice that the name and the framing have shifted a bit. This show has been around for more than 2 years. During that time, I've had conversations with financial advisors, business leaders, and subject matter experts about how forward-thinking leaders got their business future ready. What's changed for me isn't who I've been talking to. It's what's become impossible to ignore underneath those conversations. Whether I'm speaking with financial advisors, business leaders, or subject matter experts, the same tension kept surfacing. Not what comes next, but how do I decide now when I don't have certainty and waiting feels risky? That question kept surfacing outside of the podcast, in boardroom meetings, in advisory conversations, in moments where the data was incomplete, but the responsibility was still very real. That's what this evolution of the podcast reflects. This is the Uncertainty Edge podcast, a show about decisions that matter, where the stakes are real, certainty is impossible, and judgment is more than simply being right or wrong. I'm Sam Sivarajan, and I want to start this next chapter with a decision context that's been studied more than almost any other, not just because it's dramatic, but because it's revealing. Mount Everest, 1996. In May of 1996, 4 groups of climbers, 33 in total, were attempting to summit Mount Everest. These were not amateurs. The guides were experienced. The climbers had trained for years. The systems were in place. The risks were known. And yet, as summit day approached, conditions began to shift. Weather patterns became unstable. Winds picked up. Visibility deteriorated. Warnings had circulated, but not in a way that stopped forward momentum. The summit was close enough to justify continuing. Turning back felt like wasted effort. Waiting felt like a lost opportunity. Progress itself became reassuring. Then, a massive storm hit. Winds became extreme, temperatures dropped sharply, and navigation became almost impossible. 8 people died. What makes Everest so instructive isn't the extremity of the environment, it's how familiar the decision dynamics are. Because if you strip away the altitude, you're left with something many of us recognize: pressure, commitment, incomplete information, and decisions that have to be made without guarantees on what happens next. The Everest disaster has been analyzed for decades, not because of mountaineering technique, but because it exposes predictable patterns in human judgment. People didn't suddenly become reckless. They became human under pressure. Signals that contradicted the plan were discounted. Commitment increased as costs mounted. Delay felt prudent until it became dangerous. Action felt decisive until it became irreversible. None of this required bad intent or incompetence. It emerged from capable people operating in conditions where uncertainty overwhelmed structure. Everest didn't create those dynamics. It simply revealed what happens when people lack a shared way of thinking through decisions when pressures rise. And that brings us to a framework many leaders still rely on to describe their environment. VUCA. VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, has been around for a long time. It's been used in military strategy, corporate planning, and leadership development. And it's not wrong. The world is volatile. Outcomes are uncertain. Systems are complex. Signals are ambiguous. The problem is that VUCA stops short of the hardest part. It describes the environment, but it doesn't help you decide within it. Most decision makers don't need to be reminded that the world is chaotic. They're living that reality every day. What they struggle with is something more specific: knowing when to move and when to wait, how to separate signal from noise, how to act without overreacting, and how to take responsibility when the data won't settle the question for them. VUCA creates awareness, but awareness doesn't produce judgment. And that gap between knowing the conditions are uncertain and knowing how to act responsibly anyway is where decision failure tends to show up. When certainty isn't available, decisions often break down in one of two ways. Either people move with haste, rushing in too quickly, acting to relieve discomfort rather than to improve outcomes, or they hesitate too long, waiting for clarity and certainty that never fully arrives. Both responses might feel responsible in the moment, but both can be costly. On Everest, some climbers continued upward because stopping felt like failure. Others delayed key calls because turning back felt premature. The issue wasn't a lack of information. It was the absence of a deliberate way to pace judgment under pressure. That's the problem space I've spent much of my career working in. Not prediction, not strategy decks, but how people actually decide when the stakes are real and certainty isn't an option. That's where my EDGE framework comes in. Not as a model you're meant to follow mechanically, and not as a promise of better outcomes. It's better understood as a rhythm, a way of slowing thinking down without stopping action. At its core, it's about establishing what actually matters, diagnosing what's signal and what's noise, acting deliberately rather than reactively, and staying adaptive without panicking or locking in too early. The value isn't in the labels. It's in creating enough structure so that judgment doesn't collapse under pressure. It's the kind of structure that was missing on Everest. Not because people didn't care, but because the environment overwhelmed their ability to think clearly together. The environments many of us operate in today may not be physically extreme, like Everest, but they share the same underlying features. Markets move quickly, expectations shift, information arrives unevenly, decisions cascade, but accountability remains real. Most organizational failures don't happen because people misunderstand the environment. They happen because decisions drift. Trade-offs stay implicit rather than explicit. Responsibility blurs, and action becomes reactive. VUCA tells you where you are. Judgment determines what you do next. That distinction and how to work with it is what this podcast is now centered around. This isn't a new podcast. It's a sharper one. Going forward, every episode, whether it's a solo conversation like this or an interview, We'll focus on real decision moments. We'll talk about uncertainty openly. We'll surface trade offs rather than hide behind them. And we will look closely at how judgment actually gets exercised when there are no guarantees. Not success stories, not predictions, and not generic leadership advice. This podcast is focused on just decisions that are made under pressure and what we can learn from them. Here's the thought I want to leave you with. Uncertainty isn't a problem to eliminate. It's a condition to act within. Everest shows us what happens when pressure, proximity, and commitment override judgment. VUCA names the environment, but judgment, practiced deliberately, is what shapes outcomes. That's what this podcast exists to explore. If this way of thinking resonates, you can subscribe to the Uncertainty Edge on Substack, where I share a bi-weekly newsletter that has decision briefings and frameworks that sit behind these conversations. Full episodes are also available wherever you get your podcasts and also on YouTube. Thanks for being here, whether you've been listening for 2 years or this is your first episode. Until next time, clarity isn't found in calm. It's practiced under pressure. This is the Uncertainty Edge podcast. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Uncertainty Edge. If today's conversation sparked something, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You'll get practical tools, deeper insights, and new episodes every other Tuesday. Please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to the newsletter at theuncertaintyedge.com.